Welcome back to Fossil Rage Games. This is going to be the third video in our epic Frosthaven series. In this video, I'm going to walk you through all of the different specialized combat abilities that exist in the game. There are 20 total. Now, what makes this game so amazing is all of the different terrain that you can fight on. In addition to that, all of the different special effects and status effects that can occur throughout the course of the game. That's what really sets this game apart from most other tactical games. This is quite honestly a tactical masterpiece. I'm going to walk you through how all of these different special abilities interact with the game. I'm also going to give you tips and tricks on when to use these different status effects to optimize their impact on the game. First up, we're going to talk about different types of damage in Frosthaven. So the game has numerous mechanics. I'm going to go ahead and just take this reference card and flip it over to show you the extreme amount of mechanics that are in this game. But that's what makes the game actually fun. It makes it very tactical and very enjoyable. Give one of these player reference cards to each person as they start the game. So next we're going to dive into different types of damage. So all of those different modifiers that I just showed you, a lot of them key off of whether it's damage, sort of like universal damage, or the fact that it's combat damage or attack damage. So as an example, if a monster comes in and then draws an attack modifier card and performs an attack action against the character, or the character does one back against the enemy and draws one of these modifier cards, that's going to be an attack action. So a lot of the sorts of mechanics in the game are going to key off of attacking. Now, if a modifier references something that's not actually an attack action, then it won't work. So kind of what does that mean? So we're going to start off by looking at some of these at the bottom of the card. And we have a shield modifier, and then we also have a retaliation modifier. So when we look at the shield modifier, it says reduce all attacks by X. So as an example, if this monster is attacking the banner spear, it's going to draw a card and then inflict its damage. So in this case, since this is an attack modifier, the shielding effect would go off. And thus the banner spear would be protected from a certain number of damage. So in this case, it says shield X. It says reduce all attacks by X. So as an example, if the banner spear has a shielding value of 1 and suffers 5 points of damage, it would reduce the attack by 1. And thus they would only take 4 points of damage instead of 5. So let's go ahead and back this enemy off, and then let's talk about trap damage and hazardous terrain damage. So as an example, this shielding effect says reduce all attacks by X. If the banner spear suffers some sort of damage that's not related to attack, the shielding actually will not protect the character from that damage. So as an example, the banner spear has their shielding effect, and they pass through this hazardous terrain, which would inflict 3 points of damage to the banner spear. Since this is not an attack style modifier, the shielding, all of that damage goes through to the banner spear. So the shielding does not impact, nor does it protect the banner spear from that damage. Same thing with a trap. If the banner spear passes through a trap, all of that damage goes through and hits the banner spear, although they have a shielding effect on them currently. So to break it down, when you're playing this game and you're using these reference cards, be super critical of what the damage type is. Is it universal damage, or is it attack damage, or some sort of attack modifier? So be very critical of that as we play the game. As I move forward, I'm going to walk you through a lot of these concepts, but I'm going to key off of the concept of it's a damage modifier, like a generic universal damage modifier, or if it's an attack modifier. The next effect that we're going to talk about is piercing, and it's just right above my thumb. Basically what this does is simply nullify shields. It's simply this: pierce X reduces target's shielding by X value. So for each point of piercing you have, it's going to reduce the amount of shielding on an enemy. So thus, if an enemy has a 3 shield and you have a pierce of 1, the enemy will have a shield rating of 2 when you make that attack. All right, so next we're going to talk about retaliation. and my thumb is right below it. The icon looks like a fist, and it's kind of hard to zoom in on some of these effects. So it says retaliate X. Attackers suffer X damage. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's go ahead and break that down. So we're going to go ahead and grab the Hound's reference card, and it actually has this as a special ability that is always on the Hound. So what does that mean? What that means is that any attack, so it has to be an attack that goes against this Hound, it can counterattack for 1 point of damage. So let's go ahead and break that down. So as an example, the Banner Spear charges the Hound and then swings at the Hound and thus inflicts, let's say, 2 points of damage or 0 points of damage. If any attack is made against the Hound, and this is going to be at close range, then what that means is that the character is going to suffer 1 point of damage. This is not going to be attack damage. This is going to be sort of that universal damage that we were talking about before. So, hey, what does that mean exactly? So let's say our Banner Spear has a shielding effect on it, and that says reduce all attacks by X. So when the Banner Spear hits this Hound, it's going to suffer 1 point of damage. Now that is not attack damage, that's going to be special ability damage. And how do you know that? Because when we retaliate, we're not actually drawing an attack modifier card from the Hound. This is a defensive ability. So this sounds a little bit complicated, a little bit confusing. So shielding actually does not work against retaliation. And the reasoning behind it is that the retaliation effect is not actually an attack action made by this enemy. So when the Banner Spear attacks, even if it has a shielding of 1, it's going to inflict 1 point of damage on the Banner Spear. So it's going to suffer 1 point of attack damage. Now, retaliation, unless it says otherwise, is always at close range. So you have to be literally attacking the enemy at close range. Now, there are some effects in the game, so I'm going to back the Banner Spear off. There is ranged retaliation in the game, and if that's the case, you're going to actually see it on the card because it's going to have one of those ranged modifiers. To finally put retaliation to rest, I'm going to give you one note, and this is a subtlety in the game. As an example, we're going to say that the Hound on the table has 3 points of damage currently when the Banner Spear is going to levy an attack against it. We know that the Hound always has a retaliation effect on it. One of the subtleties of the game, and I see this confusion in a lot of the new players, when you make an attack against an enemy and you kill the enemy and remove it from the table with your attack, it does not retaliate. So as an example, the Banner Spear is at point blank range on the Hound, performs an attack action, and let's say it hits the Hound for 2 points of damage. That 2 points of damage is going to give the Hound 5 wounds, which exceeds its maximum hit points. So thus the Hound is removed from the table. The Hound is thus removed from the table before it performs the retaliation. So if you can kill an enemy and remove it from the table, it doesn't actually retaliate. So consequently, I'm going to take all of the wounds off the Hound. The Banner Spear attacks and thus inflicts 2 points of damage onto the Hound. So I'm going to do 1 and 2. Since the Hound survives the attack, it gets to retaliate, so thus the Banner Spear would suffer 1 point of damage. Next, we're going to talk about Ward. So I'm holding a Ward token in the middle of my hand. Kind of looks almost like a purple icon with like an energy shield around it. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that off. Now, when we're looking at Ward, and I'm going to try to zoom in on this so we can take a look at the verbiage. So it says Ward, have or round down the next source of damage, then remove. So please note that this says damage, not attack damage. So how does this card actually work? We're going to pop back into the game. So we're going to say that in this case, our Banner Spear has a Ward token on it. And like typically I try to keep these off the board and just put it on the player board when you're actually playing the game. So as an example, down here, there's a condition effect area. Now, I typically tell new players just to put all the effects on their hit point dial. I think it's easier to see that because they sometimes forget it when they put it on their player card. So in this example, we're going to say that the Hound is going to attack the Banner Spear, and it's going to typically inflict 2 points of damage. We roll a damage modifier card, and it's going to amplify it up to 4 points of damage. So the very first time the Banner Spear suffers damage, and this is going to be any damage, it's going to have that damage. So as an example, we're going to inflict now 4 points of damage against the Banner Spear, but since it has a ward token, we're going to pull that off, and thus it's going to reduce the damage down by 2 points of damage. We're going to cut that damage in half. Please note that we're going to round down. What makes ward especially effective is when you're fighting heavy boss style creatures. So maybe, we're going to say that this big ugly thing is a boss style creature, or something that just hits really heavy. If this thing is going to inflict, let's say, 8 to 10 points of damage on you in one round, using the ward effect is a great time to do that. Now, here's the problem with sort of how the ward effect works. You can't choose when it goes off. It's just simply going to be the first time you suffer damage. So what does that mean? Let's say we're fighting two different monsters, the Hound and then this big ugly Algox. In this case, the ward is going to trigger immediately the first time you suffer any damage. You can't choose when the ward actually goes off. So something else that's kind of interesting with a ward, this is any damage source. So if the Banner Spear crosses through a trap space, and let's say this is going to be 3 points of damage, the Banner Spear would suffer 3 points of damage, and then the ward token actually comes off the table. And thus the Banner Spear would suffer half damage that is rounded down. So in this case, it's going to be 3 points of damage, rounded down, which is only going to be 1 point of damage. So the ward can actually protect you from trap damage as well. Sort of the opposite of ward is Brittle. This is a damage effect. It looks like ice that's kind of shattering. Now, this is a pretty cool mechanic that's also in the game. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the effect modifier card. So it says Brittle, double the next source of damage, then remove, also remove when healed. So this is going to be not just attack damage, any source of damage. So we're going to show you how that actually works. We're going to go ahead and pop back up to the map, and we're going to throw our Banner Spear and our Hound back onto the table. So we're going to say that our Banner Spear is Brittle, and in this case, the Hound is attacking the Banner Spear. So we're going to flip an attack modifier card over, and in this case, it's going to be a 1. The Hound has a normal attack of 2, so we're going to amplify that attack up to a 3. Now here's the problem. The Banner Spear has a Brittle effect on it, which means it's going to double the next source of damage. This source of damage is 3 points from the Hound. Thus, the Banner Spear is going to suffer 6 points of damage. We're going to take that Brittle token off the table. Brittle is an extremely dangerous effect in the game of Frosthaven, and this is the first time that we're seeing it. It did not exist in Gloomhaven. Be really, really critical of anything that is putting Brittle tokens actually onto you. It can be a real nightmare. Now, there's another caveat to Brittle, and we kind of talked about it, but I'm going to just walk you through it. It says, also remove when healed. So what's kind of interesting about this is, let's say the Banner Spear has a Brittle token actually on them, and then they heal themselves. And this could be any sort of healing effect, or it could even be, let's say, a long rest. So as an example, we're going to take all of the enemies off the table, and the Banner Spear is sitting on the table. Banner Spear performs a long rest action. Now, when we do a long rest action, kind of what we learned from a previous video is that the Banner Spear is going to be healed for 2 points of damage. So we're going to take this Brittle token off whenever the Banner Spear is healed, and it's going to be anytime a healing effect goes off, so immediately you're going to pull that off. Something else that we're going to talk about is, once again, the concept of other damage sources. So we can have hazardous terrain or traps. If the Banner Spear crosses through a trap space while being Brittle, it's going to double that damage as well, because this is universal damage, not necessarily attack damage. The next status effect that we're going to talk about is Poison. It looks like a skull. It's green, and there's 2 X's on the skull. I'm going to go ahead and place this onto the Banner Spear, and we're going to look at our reference card. And this simply says all attackers gain +1 attack, prevents healing, and remove when healed. Let's go ahead and walk through what that means. In this case, the Banner Spear is poisoned, and we have a Hound on the table. The Hound gets to make an attack action. We're going to roll a 0 modifier. 2 base plus 0 means that the attack against the Banner Spear is a 2. Now here's the thing, the Hound gets a +1 attack because the Banner Spear is poisoned. So we're going to amplify that damage to 3 points of damage. Here's why poison is so nasty in this game. Let's say we have our big ugly monster back in the game and it makes an attack also against the Banner Spear. That monster also gets a +1 attack against that character. If a character is surrounded and is poisoned, they're going to be taking a ridiculous amount of damage. So be very, very mindful of when your character is poisoned. Also be mindful of when an enemy is poisoned as well. So maybe, in this case, we've got Big Ugly here on the table, and maybe that's some sort of boss style character. We're going to then just say, hey, we've got our friends here. Now, all of the characters would then inflict +1 damage against that enemy as well. Use poison against something that's heavily armored. Well, what does that mean? Something with a shield icon. Now, remember that you're going to be adding 1 point of damage per attack made against that enemy. So if this thing is shielded, that's really effective at sort of breaking through some of that shielding because you're going to be doing extra damage against that enemy. The next thing that we're going to talk about on this is that it prevents healing. And this is a really obnoxious mechanic, and it makes poison really, really dangerous in this game. So as an example, we're going to say that, the Banner Spear maybe only has 2 hit points left and is in real trouble. If the Banner Spear goes to heal, well, guess what happens? No healing actually goes off. So as an example, maybe the Banner Spear heals themselves for 3 points of damage. Normally what would happen is the Banner Spear would go from 2 to 5 hit points, but since there's a poison effect on them, it simply pulls the poison effect marker off them and they don't actually heal. That's a pretty crazy effect, and that's something that is super dangerous, especially when you're low on hit points. It prevents you from healing. Now, when a healing effect goes off, you immediately pull this off the table, which is really fantastic. So be extremely mindful of when poison effects are on your character or poison effects are on enemies. Next up is going to be Regeneration. It looks like a hand, and this is a pink icon. We're going to go ahead and throw this onto the Banner Spear, and then we're going to check our handy dandy reference card right here. And this one's going to be at the top. It says Regenerate, +1 hit point at the start of turn and remove when damaged. Let's go ahead and walk through how this effect works. Let's say it's the Banner Spear's turn. It's the beginning of their turn. And we were talking previously that the Banner Spear is kind of banged up. Maybe they had the poison token on them. Now that the poison token is off, they have a regeneration token on them. It's the start of their turn. They have 2 hit points. That just means at the start of their turn, they're going to increase from 2 hit points to 3 hit points. They're going to heal for 1 point. Next up, this effect says remove when damaged. The Banner Spear has this awesome regeneration effect on them. If the Banner Spear suffers any type of damage, it could be going through a trap, or it could be suffering damage from the Hound, or it could be if the Banner Spear hits the Hound and then the Retaliation effect goes off on the Hound, any damage source is going to remove this regeneration token from the game. Regeneration is new in Frosthaven, didn't exist in Gloomhaven. I think it's a pretty cool mechanic. The next effect is Wound. This is an orange token, and it looks like there's a gash that's bleeding on this. We're going to take this, and we're going to throw it onto the Banner Spear. And this is going to be the exact opposite of Regeneration. So we're going to go ahead and go to our reference card. It says Wound, suffer 1 point of damage at the start of each turn and remove when healed. This is basically the exact opposite of Regeneration. Let's go ahead and work through that. Let's say our Banner Spear is on the table, and in this case, they had 5 hit points, and it's the start of their turn. Since they're wounded, they're going to suffer 1 point of damage at the very beginning of their turn, thus dropping their hit points from 5 down to 4. Now the next part of this, it simply says remove this token when the character is healed. This is going to be different from poison. When a person was poisoned and they were healed, they didn't actually heal. In this case, it's going to be a little bit different. Let's say the Banner Spear, has 4 hit points left on them, and then they perform some sort of heal action on the turn, which is going to heal them for 3 points of damage. What happens is that the wound comes off the character and they get to heal, so thus they go from 4 to 7 hit points. The wound does not prevent them from actually healing. So when should you be using wound in Frosthaven? These are my personal preferences actually on this. Wound is really great for heavily shielded targets with low hit points. As an example, maybe we have something that has, let's say, a 3 shield on it, but only has 2 hit points. We're just going to imagine that the Hound is one of those monsters. Hitting it every turn, because it has a 3 shield, is very, very unlikely. But if we put a wound token on an enemy, it simply suffers damage at the start of its turn. Since it is not attack damage, it's damage generated from an effect, the shield does not protect that monster, and thus it's just going to take 1 point of damage at the start of its turn. That's a pretty impactful mechanic. Something else I like to do is wound archers. So as an example, we have an Algox archer actually on the map itself. Archers are pretty annoying because what they're always going to do on their turn is they're going to be backing away from you to sort of maximize the distance between you, and they're going to be shooting arrows at you or throwing things at you. In this case, sometimes they're very hard to get to, so if you can put some sort of damage effect on them, then they start suffering damage every round, and thus you're going to soften them up by the time you actually reach them. So those are kind of my recommendations on wound. The final recommendation is also that if you become wounded, be super critical and super careful if you have low hit points. This can be a really sort of tricky thing. You don't always have healing effects available, and you can actually just suffer lethal damage at the start of your turn. Let's say you have 1 hit point and you're wounded, you're going to suffer lethal damage and potentially be removed from the game and exhausted if you don't spend a card to prevent that point of damage. So be super critical and careful when your character gets down to low hit points if you're wounded. Next up, I'm going to go through a pretty strange conversation. This is going to be if, let's say, you have multiple status effects on you. In this case, we're going to say that we have Regeneration, Poison, and Wound all on the Banner Spear. And we're going to try to figure out kind of what that actually means in the game. We're going to just take the Hound off the table, and we're going to focus on the beginning of the Banner Spear's turn and what kind of is going to be happening for that. So we have 2 different mechanics. We have Regeneration and Wound, which are the opposite of each other, and both of them say at the start of the turn, do something. One of them wounds you, and in the other case, the other one is actually going to heal you. So at the start of the turn, both of these effects are going to go off at the same time, but you get to choose the order of those effects. So as an example, at the start of our turn, we're going to say that our Regeneration goes off before the wound actually goes off. So what I'm going to do is say, hey, I'm going to heal for 1 point of damage. So in this case, what happens is that when you would heal sort of that 1 point of damage, a couple things are actually going to occur. One, since I am healing a point of damage, I can remove both the wound and the poison effect at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. But since the Banner Spear is actually poisoned, I'm not going to heal that 1 point of damage. So if you have a bunch of these effects stacked on you, all sorts of strange things can happen at the start of your turn. So as an example, maybe you have like a combo of, let's put these up on the screen, Ward and Wound, which can be a little bit sort of strange. So let's say both of those are stacked on the character at the start of their turn. So at the start of the turn, the character is going to become wounded. Now, what does that mean? The character is going to suffer 1 point of damage, which is then going to trigger the ward's effect because it's just going to go off the next time the damage is received. When this happens, the wound is going to hit the Banner Spear for 1. The ward is going to come off the Banner Spear. and you're going to round the damage down. So we're going to have a half a point of damage. We're going to round that down to 0. So be really critical and careful when you have all of these different status effects piled on a character or an enemy. And just understand that at the start of your turn, you get to define and decide the order in which those go off. Next, we're going to talk about Bane. This icon looks like a sword piercing a heart, and it has a black background on it. We're going to say that that ends up on the banner spear. We're going to go to our reference card and kind of walk you through what that means. It says suffer 10 points of damage at the end of next turn, then remove. Also remove when healed. What that means is that the banner spear has to try to get this Bane effect off of them by the end of their next turn, and if they don't, they're going to suffer 10 points of damage, and that's going to be at the end of the turn, not actually at the beginning. So sort of the caveat for that is that oftentimes when you're playing Frosthaven, most of the characters have some sort of healing either effect that they can have, whether it's some sort of potion, or it's something in their attack modifier deck, or it can be something as simple as just like a healing effect. And just note that if you don't get this off, it's going to inflict 10 points of damage, but then the token actually comes off the table. So it's only going to hit you once, but it is going to hit you like a freight train for 10 points of damage. So the other caveat, and I do want to mention this to you as well, is that anytime you suffer damage, you can discard, let's say, 1 card from your hand, or you can discard cards from your discard pile to prevent that damage. And this is a good time to actually do that. If you are unlucky enough for Bane to go off, 10 points of damage is a massive hit in this game. So as an example, let's say you have a set of cards in your hand. That would be a perfect time to take one of your cards and burn it, thus removing it from the game to prevent those 10 points of damage. In addition to that, if you have, let's say, 2 cards in your discard pile and your hand size is very low, you can always discard those 2 cards from your discard pile to prevent that 10 points of damage. Next up, we're going to look at the push action. It says force target to move X away. So we're going to snap back to the game board and take a look at that. As an example, if I have a push action of 1, what it does is it forces me to move an enemy 1 space away from me. But when I'm moving an enemy, it physically has to increase in distance from me. So here's an example where I have the banner spear, the hound, and then I have a trap on the right-hand side. Now, what most people try to do, and rightfully so in the game, is try to position enemies so that they go through traps or hazardous terrain and thus suffer damage. So in this case, when I'm doing a push action, I can't move the hound to any adjacent space around me, because the distance between me and the enemy has to increase by 1. So thus, if I do a push action, I'm going to choose a direction of travel for the hound. And if I pick this direction, it moves 1 space this way. I can also say, hey, I want to move the hound in this direction, and then it would move this way. Or I could push the hound 1 spot in this direction. But if I'm not actually increasing the distance between myself and the hound, that's an illegal move. So thus, I could never move the hound using a push action onto the trap that's just right next to me. Something else that we can then take into account, and we'll go ahead and do this in reverse. Next, we have the same sort of effect. This is going to be a pull effect. It says pull X, force target to move X closer. So think of it as you're like pulling that enemy in toward you. So the same thing applies. If I have a pull of 1, I'm going to move the hound 1 space toward me. Now, what else is also interesting about this, and I can do it at any angle, but what I really want to do is sort of maximize those push and pull options. And a lot of times you don't get to move the same turn that you do a push or a pull action. So it's almost something that you have to set up sort of ahead of time. So as an example, maybe I have the game board set up like this. And on 1 turn, I'm going to move over here, and then I do a ranged attack. Then on the next turn, I'm going to do a pull action. I'm going to pull the hound onto the trap. So there's a lot of strategy when it comes to push and pull actions that can, really enhance the game. But just always understand that for each point of movement on a push or pull action, you actually have to adjust the range between yourself and whatever you're push or pulling. At least one per every space that you're push or pulling. Next, we have two different options that I'm going to talk about. We have curse cards and we also have blessing cards. The curse card is going to be located at the top, and then the blessing card is going to be located at the bottom of the screen. These are going to be effects that trigger in the game, which says, let's say, a character of some sort, and this could be enemies or this could be the players. Any sort of model can be cursed or blessed as long as it has a draw deck, one of the combat action draw decks. So these get shuffled directly into those decks. Now they look identical to sort of the critical miss and the critical hit cards that are already in your deck, except there's one distinction on these. Whenever these trigger, they're then permanently removed from your deck. So as an example, if you suffer a curse, you would take one of these curse cards, you would take it and then shuffle it into your draw deck. And then as you start cycling through, when this thing comes into play, it goes off. So you would suffer the curse and thus miss your attack, and the enemy would suffer no damage from that. Then you take this and it's simply removed from the game. Blessing is the same way as well. So when you take a blessing card and your character, let's say, gets blessed, or an enemy gets blessed, you take it and then you shuffle it into the corresponding draw deck, and then when this thing pops out, you get, basically double damage. So if you pull like a 3 attack or whatever, and then this thing triggers, then you'd hit for 6 points, then this thing is consequently also removed from the game. So one of the strange caveats about this is that there are basically 10 of each of these that get kind of shuffled in, at least into the player deck. And then there's going to be a separate set of curses, which I'm going to go ahead and just pop onto the screen. And these are going to have an M in the bottom left-hand corner. So these specifically go into the monster or the enemy sort of draw deck. Now the other ones that go into the player's draw deck, I'm going to mouse over this or zoom into this. If you can see this, there's a little star at the bottom corner. And what that means is that these are the ones that get shuffled into the player's deck. All right, next is Immobilize. This icon is a boot with an arrow sticking in it. And basically what this means is that while you're under the influence of an Immobilize effect, you are unable to move yourself. So that means that there's no move abilities or move actions that you can perform until the end of your next turn. Now, what that means is that if you're under an Immobilize effect, something else in the game can still move you. And I know this sounds a little bit strange. You can't move yourself, but something else can. So let's say we have our hound and it's a super powered hound and it now has a pull effect. Although you're immobilized, the hound's pull or push effects will still go off. You just can't move actively on your own until the end of the next turn. And then when that happens, just simply pull the token off your character. So why would you ever want to use an Immobilize effect? And the answer is pretty simple. This is going to be a defensive posture. If we look on the screen, our banner spear is in immediate danger. The banner spear is basically surrounded by 3 different enemies. And if the banner spear doesn't get out of there, they're all going to inflict a massive amount of damage. So in this case, we're going to assume that all of these enemies are melee-style hand-to-hand combat enemies. So if the banner spear can, let's say, immobilize several of them and then back up, what that does is it nullifies their attack, and they can't actually move or chase any of the characters around on the game board itself. So that's a huge defensive advantage. So if you want to avoid suffering damage, think of it this way. You're maybe sitting here at the start of your turn. Go ahead and hit them, attack them, and then maybe use that immobilize effect and then move away so they can't chase you and do additional damage to you. Next, we have the Disarm detrimental effect. So as an example, we're going to say that this is on the banner spear. When a model is disarmed, and enemies and characters alike can be disarmed, they can't actually perform any attack abilities. So as an example, if we have just one of our normal cards, we have 2 different options. One, on the top panel of this card, we have an ability. This is an attack ability because it has an attack icon on it. If you're disarmed, you will not be able to do this. In conjunction with that, we have our basic generic attack ability on a card. You actually can't use that as well. So anything that you would need to attack with, and this is going to be something that you would pull one of your attack cards for when you're performing an action, you cannot trigger those abilities until the end of your next turn. And when that happens, the token comes off just like a lot of the other effects. All right, next is going to be the stun detrimental effect, which looks like this. We're going to say that the banner spear is stunned. Any model in the game, that could be an enemy or a character that is stunned, cannot perform any abilities or use triggered items until the end of their next turn. It's very similar to a lot of the other effects. It'll come off at the end of your next turn. So as an example, if a player gets stunned, let's say the banner spear is stunned and then they go to do their turn, well, they still have allocated cards for their turn, but they can't use anything on them. So just basically take both of the cards on your character and stick them into your discard pile. Nothing can go off and nothing can trigger on any of these cards. You can't use any of the abilities. You simply can't move, you can't attack, you can't heal. You basically can't use any abilities until this resolves. Now, this is a great special ability to use on enemies. So let's say the banner spear is fighting a big ugly monster, and the amount of versatility on stun is absolutely amazing. So if you stun this enemy, it can't attack you, it can't move, it can't heal. Sometimes enemies will summon other enemies onto the game map. It basically just locks that enemy down for a round. So the host of things that you can do are absolutely amazing. Maybe the banner spear is low on life. You can stun the enemy and then move your character away. Or maybe you can tell that you're fighting a spellcaster and this thing is constantly summoning enemies onto the map. If you stun that enemy, it can't be generating any additional troops. Or maybe you're fighting a healer and you are tired of it healing, and once you lock it down for that turn, it can't do anything. Stun is extremely versatile, and it allows you to take a breather and really reposition yourself and kind of get the game back under control for the heroes. All right, so next up is Impaired, and this is going to be new to the Frosthaven game. This didn't exist in Gloomhaven. We're going to go ahead and say that our banner spear is impaired. And what that means is that the banner spear cannot use items, and this token gets removed at the end of the next turn. So kind of what that means is that, let's say the banner spear has this shield in their inventory, and they want to use it as a triggered effect during combat. So what makes this kind of tough is that the banner spear can't use any sort of items or triggered item abilities until the end of their next turn because their inventory is essentially locked down and their items are all impaired. Now, this is kind of an interesting mechanic, especially if you have healing potions in the game. This can be a really frustrating effect. I've seen a couple times when you're playing, your character is impaired and you want to use a healing potion. Maybe you only have 2 hit points left or something of that nature. You can't actually use the healing potion for that. Other than that, I don't think it's a huge impact to the game. It's not as dangerous as some of the other ones that we've talked about, like Stun or Immobilize. Next, we're going to talk about Muddle, which is a brown question mark icon. So for this example, we're going to say that this large enemy is muddled. When something is muddled, it is going to have disadvantage on all of its attacks until the end of the next turn. And then at the end of the next turn, the token comes off the model. Now, what makes this interesting is that it's a good defensive ability. So let's say this big ugly monster charges and then it attacks the banner spear. Anytime something has advantage or disadvantage, you're going to draw 2 attack modifier cards. In the case of disadvantage, we're going to draw 2. So the monster gets a +1 and then it gets a -2. And since we are playing at disadvantage, the lower attack modifier takes precedence. And so thus, since the enemy is muddled, it's going to, in general, be inflicting less damage. Now, what's interesting about this is that if this enemy is muddled and it has a multi-attack and it's attacking both of the heroes, both of those attacks are going to be muddled. So we already did the banner spear attack. So next we're going to get 2 cards as it attacks the other character. In this case, they're both zeros. You're going to take the lower of the 2, but since they're identical, nothing really happens. So muddling creatures is extremely important, especially if they have multi-attack. It's a really fantastic way to give yourself an advantage against a big, ugly, threatening monster. Next up is the Strengthen special effect. This is going to be the exact opposite of Muddle. And here's the icon. It looks like somebody flexing their muscle, and it's blue. We're going to go ahead and throw this onto our banner spear. Now, the exact opposite of Muddle is Strengthen, and what Strengthen says is that all of your attacks gain advantage until the end of your next turn. So kind of what does that mean? So as an example, let's say the banner spear has Strengthen and then goes to attack the Hound. So in this case, we're going to draw 2 cards for the banner spear and take the best one. So in this case, we're going to take the +1 over the -2. Thus, on average, when a model is strengthened, so both the heroes and the enemies can be strengthened in this game, they're going to inflict a little bit more damage every time they attack. Now, here's the other caveat in conjunction with Muddle. If something has strengthened, it's going to gain advantage on all of its attacks. So if an enemy has multi-attack, then that enemy can hit multiple things using advantage, so thus drawing 2 cards. In addition, the hero can as well. So when's the best place or the best time to play a strengthened modifier? And that's when, in some of those rare cases, a hero can multi-attack. So on the top portion of the card and the bottom portion of the card, there can often be attacks on that. So if a character is strengthened for that, they would gain advantage and thus do a little bit more damage on each of those attacks. So be on the lookout for those somewhat rare times where your character can multi-attack. And also be wary of any sort of enemy if they are strengthened, and try to lock them down, either stun them or maybe immobilize them so they're not multi-attacking numerous people in the group. All right, so next up we have the Invisibility special ability, which is very, very cool. In this case, we're going to take this marker and we're going to place it next to the Blink Blade. When a model is invisible, it cannot be targeted. Now, that's a pretty cool special ability, and it allows you a reprieve from attacks. Another thing that is very useful for is when you're opening a door to another room. So as we've talked about in a previous video, when you open a door, it kind of makes you the center of attention, and everything in the room, since you're closest to everything when you go into the next room, is going to target you. So as an example, the Blink Blade is invisible, moves onto the doorway, we flip the doorway over, thus opening the door to the next room. And then we expose a whole host of enemy monsters in the next room. Now, what's interesting about this is that they don't actually see the Blink Blade, but they can see all the other characters as normal and can target them appropriately. Something else, and this is a little bit of a subtlety that occurs in Frosthaven. In Frosthaven, the enemies can actually move through you, okay? And so that's a little bit of a difference from the last version of Gloomhaven, where they couldn't actually move through you. So in this case, the Hound can charge through the Blink Blade, but cannot end its movement on top of the Blink Blade itself. Now, another thing that this gives you a reprieve from is when this character is invisible, it can't be targeted. That's a great time to perform a long rest action. Oftentimes, it's really tough in the middle of battle, especially if you're running low on cards or you're running low on hit points. Long resting can be kind of a dangerous prospect. So as an example, maybe the Blink Blade is in this room and is really just getting hammered by these monsters and needs to perform a long rest. The Blink Blade goes invisible and thus cannot be targeted by any of these enemies until the end of the Blink Blade's next turn. That gives the Blink Blade a reprieve and allows the Blink Blade to long rest without being injured. So it's a great way to sort of break up a really bad situation for your character if they're surrounded. It's also a really good technique when you're opening a door. So thus, the character opening the door just doesn't get annihilated immediately when it walks into the room. So to summarize, we've gone over literally all of the different special abilities that appear on these player reference cards. If you need any advice or hints, please go to the rulebook. There's a lot of good information in the rule book. Really what I wanted to do is provide you just a general overview of what all of the different abilities do so that you can start diving into the game and you can start playing it. Literally one of the most difficult aspects of this game is that when you start going through your basically your draw deck. So as an example, as I start just going through these cards that I've never played before, I'm start looking at all of these symbols and whatnot and all of these different modifiers, and it can be really complex and really confusing. It's very daunting when you first start playing either Frosthaven or Gloomhaven. So really the intent of this video was to give you a nice overview of those cards so that the first time you play this game, or maybe you've played a couple times and the game is confusing, you just have a better understanding of overall what you're looking at. So I highly recommend keeping this with you the entire time. So keep your player reference card with you the entire time and check it often. I want to thank you today for joining me, and as always, have fun gaming.